Yes, because I do always post this up on YouTube, like on it'll be later tonight or early in the morning, because we have a lot of people in other countries and they can't, come live, so they watch it on the replay. And I will post tomorrow that it's available on the replay. So, I am so like not with it today. I have a beautiful, I believe, introduction to Bruce. So let me get this up here.
I'm gonna
And
go on mute then, okay?
if you want to, that's fine. Yeah, anything to keep things quiet in the background. But I always encourage people to ask questions, and I will make sure I get over to Facebook to see if there's questions there. So Bruce is an award-winning public speaker and a veteran editor with significant expertise in presenting ideas through multiple channels, including radio, print, and social media. His years of editorial experience at Bloomberg News and at the Associated Press turned him into an exceptional storyteller with the ability to distill complex ideas into compelling narratives. He recently published Heartfelt Goodbye: How to Write and Deliver the Eulogy Your Loved One Deserves. I probably should have seen that when my husband passed away. But he had a good send off anyway. So Bruce, thank you so much for joining us today. Yes, your credentials are very impressive.
Well, thank you very much. And I just want to echo that if anybody has any questions, please jump in because Paul and I were planning this to be a little bit more of a free for all, talking about editing, talking about grammar, or anything basically that people need to know. If there's anything in particular you want me to start off with, Paula, or anything?
Well, we're all romance authors, and I right now I'm promoting a fantasy sci-fi authors summit that is starting next week that I'm co-hosting. And I always ask people, what is this thing that you struggle with the most? And it is almost always split between marketing and editing. So editing is very definitely a concern for people. A lot of people don't know where to start with that. I try to give them, some advice on that. But why don't you give your take on editing? Because,
All right.
it is an expensive thing and people are, sometimes hesitant to pay all that money and not know what they're going to get.
Yeah, and you're right. It can be very expensive, but let me give you some advice on how to perhaps save yourself on some of the expenses first before you go looking for the editing. And what I always tell people to do is before your manuscript should ever go to somebody that you're paying to look at it, it should go through a writers group. If you know other people. A writers group is always a good first step, especially if it's a group of writers that are in your genre, that understand your genre a little bit. That's not necessarily bad that if you have one or two that aren't in your genre, but if they're in your genre, they can point out the obvious, the tropes, the cliches, the things that need to be fixed right away, long before you go to an editor. The nice thing about having a couple of people outside your genre look at the book in a writers group is that they'll look at it with fresh eyes. Now, if you're only interested in getting readers that follow your genre, that's fine. But if you want a broader audience, sometimes it's good to have those outside eyes looking at it as well. So that's my first suggestion to everybody. Don't go to a professional editor until after you've gone through a writers group, taken all their feedback, incorporated it, and then you ought to go and do a round of beta readers. And these are people that have not seen your manuscript before, but like romance, like the genre, and can really appreciate what you're doing. And send it to them with some questions about what you might want them to look at. A little bit of a deadline. Don't let them just let it sit on it. Give them 2-3 weeks, whatever, but pick a deadline for them to get back to you. Then incorporate their assessments into your manuscript. Only at that point, really, should you consider going and paying somebody? Now, the argument is that it's hard to get a writers group together, and that is true. It can be very difficult. But, try writers forums online, try the Facebook groups, try your local library, community college, put up signs saying, hey, anybody interested? Try to get 4 or 5 people, usually no more than 5 people that are sort of in the same situation as you. In other words, if you're an aspiring writer who's never published before, you want to get people that are aspiring writers who are in the sort of the same boat, so you can bounce ideas off each other. You don't want to be the newbie in a group that's published 4 or 5 books each, because you're not really adding value to them. Writers groups can be time intensive, because you're getting feedback from them, but at the same time you have to give them feedback, and you got to take that seriously. But once you get through the writers group and the beta reader group, that's when you can actually start to look at professional editing. And it's true, it can be very expensive. There's a blog called on reedsy.com, reedsy.com, and they have a blog post, and they've just put up, believe it or not, just the other day, a pricing calculator based on, and I've got it on my other screen. They based it on marketplace data collected in 2024. And they said it costs a good bit of money, but they put it in a different genre. So for a romance novel of 40,000 words, they're saying it could cost you $976 for developmental editing, $812 for copy editing, $588 for proofreading. So I mean, that's an investment. That's a bit of money, do people know the difference between the different types of editing, or should I just go ahead?
Well, I think maybe just a very brief explanation might be helpful, because a lot of our members are newer.
Okay, sure. The editorial assessment, if you hire an editor just to give you an assessment of your manuscript, they're looking at the big picture. They're looking at whether or not the story kind of works, if the protagonist makes sense, if the story fits in the genre, that kind of thing. But it's all pretty much big picture. And generally speaking, my advice is that you don't need an editorial assessment if you're going through a writer's group that understands your genre, because they will point all that stuff out to you. But if you're writing solo and you're really unsure, then it makes sense maybe to hire an editor who can give you an assessment of your manuscript. But again, according to reedsy.com, that's $700 if for a romance novel of 40,000 words. And most of these editors do charge per word. So if you have an 80,000 word manuscript, that's going to be double. Developmental editing is a little more hands-on in the sense that they're going to look at whether the conflicts work, whether the story flows correctly, whether the protagonist, antagonist makes sense, whether the style is correct. They're pretty much high picture, but they're getting a little more granular and giving you detailed suggestions about how to change maybe the flow of the story, the tone maybe. But they're doing a little bit more than just coming up with ideas. And then the copy editing, those are the ones that are going to look at your grammar, your typos. They're going to catch. They may catch things like inconsistency of tone. They may catch things like inconsistencies of facts. Like if you call a character John in chapter 3, and you call him Joe in chapter 10, they might catch stuff like that. So copy editor is a little bit more hands-on. They may ask you to move sections around, kill sections, things of that nature. And then a proofreader is sort of the last step before publishing, where that person's just literally going through and just checking for typos and grammar. And you can't rely on like a grammar checker online for that, because a grammar checker online might not pick up on homonyms and words that make sense but aren't correct in that context. You know, like there and there. Don't look over there, or their book is over there. They're not going to know the difference between those on grammar checkers online. So you do sort of need a proofreader. I saw somebody was asking if editing is part of the publishing process. That is true. A publisher will then look at your piece long after you've already gone through it. But they're not going to take the piece unless they think it's fairly in decent shape. You know, don't expect to send a manuscript in with typos, a lot of grammar mistakes, and just very chunky language and have them edit into something proper. That's not what most publishers do anymore. It's just not a thing. And I don't know with romance per se. Paula, you probably know more than I do. But the big publishers, the traditional 5 big publishers, they almost never take unsolicited manuscripts. You have to go through an agent to get to them. And the agents aren't going to want to look at a manuscript unless it's already been edited. So
you're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct in that.
Yeah. So it's unfortunate to say, but it's on our shoulders. If you're a writer, it's on our shoulders to have the story edited even before it gets to the agent or editor at the publisher. They might make changes, but the fact is it should be professionally edited before that. Is that a pretty good overview, Paula, or is there anything else?
I'm having a hard time unmuting myself. You did an excellent job, Bruce. Thank you so much. Because a lot of people, and that is one of the big questions I get from newer authors is, you know, is an editor an editor an editor? It's like, no.
No, and the fact of the matter is, if you're focused on the romance genre, you really do need to find an editor who knows the romance genre. And that's one of the first things you should ask. If you're approaching an editor about, even before cost or anything, you want to make sure they know your genre, that they've edited your genre. I would suggest that you ask for references. You know, ask them, what other authors have you edited in the genre that you're in? And reach out to those authors to make sure that happened. Because an editor that focuses on romance is going to know a lot of different things that an editor who focuses on science fiction doesn't know. It's just that simple.
You're absolutely correct, Bruce. I'll speak to that on my personal experience. One time, I don't know, 1 or 2 books back, I wanted to this was more with a professional beta reader rather than an editor, but the same thing applies. I found a person that I thought would be great, paid the money, and the stuff I got back, the recommendations I got back is like, oops, he really likes like the crime thrillers. I don't have a crime thriller here. So it's so important to make sure that whoever you work with on whatever level is uh, does work in your genre, because there are expectations for different genres that just don't work together.
Yeah. And they would know things like what would be a proper length of a romance novel versus a science fiction novel and things of that nature, and can help fashion your manuscript to that length to catch an agent's attention. Paula, you probably know this. I've been on a lot of podcasts where agents say they may only read like the first few paragraphs of a manuscript or the first chapter, and then they move on. The attention span is so short nowadays. They just don't have time to really delve into a manuscript unless you catch them right away with clean, strong copy. If you hand them copy where there's typos and grammar mistakes on the first page, it's going to be a hard sell. It really is.
I was talking to an agent last year, I think, for my Writing Romance Mastery Summit in August. And she said that it's not unusual to get 100 submissions a day. and you know, when you get that kind of stuff, there's no way that you can go through it. And she was saying, you know, people complain about getting form letter rejections, and she says the truth is, if they have not submitted in the way that I asked them to submit, if they decide they want to submit it a different way, she says it's a reject right there. And you know, I don't even have time to tell them this is why I'm rejecting you.
Mm.
So you make a very good point there, Bruce.
Yeah, yeah. Did somebody else have a question about? Should also know. Okay, somebody's saying no grammar mistakes even. Yeah, you know, it's hard to get all the grammar correct, but you should try as much as possible. Try to make everything as perfect as possible. And that's why you want to have a lot of eyes on your manuscript before it goes to the professional editor, because what you want the professional editor to do is to pick out those grammar mistakes that aren't the obvious ones, that aren't the obvious typos. And you know, I used to say in the newsroom that if the range of a good story is from here to here, and you're handing in something with a lot of typos and grammar mistakes, and it's all the way down at the bottom, I might take the time to lift your story up to here, but I'm not going to have time to lift it up this high. It's just, it wouldn't be worth it to me as an editor to spend that much time, or an agent to spend that much time. So what you want to do is you want to bring your manuscript in as high as possible, so this way it can go up to that level. So yeah, be careful with grammar mistakes, because they will throw people off. Yeah, that's what he's saying. Yeah, there are grammar points that will trip up people, because you may have learned grammar one way, but the grammar's changed, or it's just not the way it is right now. I always point to the word impact. You know, that was never a verb when I when I was growing up. Oops, I seem to have lost my camera here. That was never a verb when I was growing up, but nowadays it kind of is acceptable, and you know, you have to stay on top of that kind of thing. The word loan used to be a noun. It was never a verb, but you see that regularly today. And depending on the agent, depending on the publisher, they may allow loan. He loaned them the money rather than he lent them the money. It's hard to know, because the last time I checked, most publishers use the Chicago Manual of Style, but that's still uniform. Oh, I seem to be having trouble with my video. Sorry about that. I don't know if that's still uniform among all publishers. You know, there are a lot of style books out there. There's the AP style book, there's the Wall Street Journal style book, there's Bloomberg News style book. The real key, I think, is consistency. If you're going to use the Chicago Manual style, stick to it throughout. And if a publisher gets a manuscript at that point and says, you know what, we actually use the AP style or some other style, they're going to work with you on that. That's not a problem, but they want the consistency. They really do. The other thing to be consistent about, and that's right. Authors should push their language forward. Could be. It depends. It depends on what you're writing. I don't think romance necessarily is the most experimental fiction as far as pushing language, but maybe that could be done. Certainly, you have more leeway, perhaps, writing today with various verbs and what have you than, say, 20 years ago.
You know, I have an opinion about this, Bruce.
Yeah.
And my opinion is that, you know, dialogue is the place, in my in my opinion, where you bring out how people talk. And how people talk will vary from one country to another, from one state to another, east, west. I'm finding it hard to understand people here in Kentucky. I'm from Oregon, but when it comes to your narrative part, um, I think that you're safer sticking with the tried and true rather than trying to push the envelope. Now, if you're writing romantasy or a romantic science fiction, maybe that's a little bit different because, those genres just in themselves kind of push the envelope a little bit. But if you're wanting to publish to sell, especially if you want to sell through the traditional publishing method, I think you got to be a little bit careful about how far you want to push that envelope.
Yeah, and I think, especially when you're establishing yourself. I mean, if Danielle Steele decided she wanted to write something experimental, she'd probably get it published because that's Danielle Steele. But if Bruce Rule approached romance publisher and said, "I've never written a romance novel, but here's my experimental fiction," probably not. Probably I'm not going to get in the door.
So can you talk to us a little bit about what are some of the biggest bugaboos, perhaps, that I mean, I have my own bugaboos that have to do with commas and things of that nature, but what are some of the things that might have an automatic rejection from an agent or a publisher?
Yeah, I've heard several, and one of them is too many ambiguous pronouns at the beginning of sentences. He said this, she said that, and people will lose track of who he and she is. Now, I've heard on some podcasts that, like, if it's more than 20% of your manuscript, that's bad, or 15% or 30%. I don't know that you want to put a percentage on ambiguous pronouns at the beginning of sentences, but you should have them as few as possible, in part because they are ambiguous. It might confuse people, but also it can be repetitious. If you have a whole paragraph, she did this, she did that, she went there, she went here, it gets boring. It gets boring. So you do want to vary that. And people have said that if there's too many of those, it can be a rejection automatically. I've heard it said that starting chapters with an ambiguous quotation, like somebody's talking but you don't know who it is, it's just a quote. I've heard that is frowned upon. I've never heard that it's an automatic rejection, but I have heard that that's something that people want you to shy away from. You don't want to just start with a dialogue and not tell the reader who's speaking.
So the question is, but why it catches attention? From a reader point of view, I'll tell you why. I hate getting halfway down a page before I know who's talking.
That's right. That's right. It may, as the author, you know who's talking, but as a reader coming to it, I'm not going to know who's talking, and it's just going to confuse me.
Yeah, unless you have such a distinct character voice that it would be very obvious. That would be about the only exception. I don't think a lot of authors, myself included, are that great at having such a distinct character voice that there's no question who is talking.
Yeah. I mean, I could see a situation where if you had, like, it was two characters in a cave in the middle of nowhere, and you'd already set it up in the previous chapter that it's only these two people, and the dialogue starts, "Tom, what are you going to do tomorrow?" Okay, I could see that because you sort of have set it up that there's only two characters. But otherwise, I just think it confuses the reader, and anything that confuses the reader is just what's the point? I don't see the point of it. Does it catch attention? But yes, but it catches the attention for the wrong reason. It confuses people. So I would not do it. One thing that I've always been against, and I don't even think this is copy editing, I think, again, it just confuses readers, is if you have characters whose names are very similar, just don't do it. Don't have, Joe, John, James, where you have everybody with a J at the beginning of this. Just don't do that. It's switch it up a little bit, because that can confuse people and people get tired of it. Trying to remember, is this John or Joe? Which character is which? Perhaps another one that I heard tell. No, that one. I've heard that this is a copy editing mistake that I haven't really noticed in books, though. Some people say that starting a new paragraph every time somebody else speaks can be frowned upon by some publishers. But I've never seen that, to be honest with you. Paul, I don't know. Have you heard of this?
No, I haven't heard of that. In fact, it would be rather confusing if you didn't start a new paragraph
I
when
would think
somebody else
so.
is talking. I know sometimes I have to go back and read something when one person is talking and they start a new subject, and so you start a new paragraph and you don't put that closing quote, but you do put the beginning quote, and that is the correct way to do it. But if somebody doesn't really pay attention that the closing quote is missing, they might think that somebody else is talking, and no, it's just a continuation of the same
Yeah.
thing. And one thing, since we're talking about punctuation a little bit, one of the things that really bugs me when I'm reviewing manuscripts for newer authors, we are so used to these days to hearing and talking in sound bites. Uh, I see a lot of times commas are put in where we would take a breath or because it is a sound bite. But the truth of the matter is, if you read the sentence, a comma is not supposed to be there. It doesn't make sense to have a comma there. So that, I think, is where things like Grammarly or Pro Writing Aid comes in handy. It
Mhm.
can find those little errors like that just reading don't really stick out for us.
But that's actually an example of trying to overwrite, where you're trying to like put in so many pauses that people are making and whatnot, and you don't need them. You don't need them. I think you're right. You don't need those kind of pauses. And yeah, trying to. I've also heard it said. This is funny because I just used the word. If the overuse of the word "said" is, if everybody's just said. Now it's funny because I come from a journalism background, and that is the typical thing to use in newspapers and in news articles. You just put Joe said, Biden said, Trump said, because it's just a tag. But in fiction, a lot of people see that as a missed opportunity, or they'd rather, if it's obvious who's talking, they'd rather have the person do a motion or take an action in between the dialogue rather than just having the person said something.
I'm glad that you brought that up, Bruce, because I've heard some very well-respected people saying that the use of said, because it is so common, that it's almost not there, so that you could use it and people just kind of don't recognize it. I disagree with that so much. I have read books where said is about the only tagline, and it gets very redundant, very
Yeah.
boring. And I agree with whoever's putting in the chat. I also like to have some action in there. And I think sometimes if you just say said, you don't know, are you saying it in anger? Are you saying it in
Mm-hmm.
joy?
Mm-hmm.
I think that the tags need to have some kind of an indication. Otherwise,
Yeah.
you kind of have a flat nothing, a
Now,
robot.
I mean, having said that, I'm one of those people that said, I never ban words. You know what I mean? I mean, there are times when said might work. I'm not thinking one off the top of my head. But if you have like some minor character who comes in and says something, you don't necessarily want to call attention to it. You could use the word said, for instance. But it can be overused, and people will see that as a mark of an amateur if it is overused.
Yeah. And then I've also heard, and I don't know if this actually goes into the editing thing, but the whole idea of if you have deep point of view, you don't need tags at all. I disagree with that. I don't think that you can, from a reader point of view, I don't think that you can get the character so deep into the point of view that you don't need some kind of a tag as to who's talking.
Yeah, and I think tags can make the story come alive. I think it deepens the story. People like action. They don't want to just hear people speaking. So, I think it's important to do that. And what I always tell, uh, especially new writers, is if you want to have, if you really want to free up your mind a little bit when you're writing, is put your characters in some action that is interesting. Because if you're also writing about action that is interesting, the story's going to move a lot faster. So in other words, instead of having two characters just sitting at lunch talking, if you have them doing something, and I'm going to make a silly suggestion, but the one is baking a cake while the other's in the kitchen talking to them. Well, now you've got some action going on. It's more vivid. It's more interesting when one character is baking a cake and the other one's talking than if they're both just sitting at the table drinking coffee. So use action when you can. That's sort of a basic thing for me.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. A lot of times I hear people say, well, write it as you are seeing the movie in your mind. I'm not sure I always see a movie in my mind, um, but we as humans are always acting in one way or another. Even just, I mean, here you probably can't see that I'm using my hands to talk,
I know so much.
but very rarely do human beings just sit there and not do anything except open their mouth and speak. So
Yeah.
um, good point. So what are some other things that from an editing point of view that we should maybe be aware of?
Well, again, these are more big picture things, but in fact, I have a book here that this book talks about it, the emotional craft of fiction. And he does short stories. He doesn't do romance. But one of the things that he said he likes to do to get the creative juices flowing and to get the story moving is he calls it the 180-degree pivot. And what that is if in your mind, as Paula was saying, you're sort of seeing it as a movie, and a character comes in, and he's almost certainly going to be familiar because that's what you see. You see it in movies. You're imagining something, but it's basically a character you've seen in movies 100 times. The mousy clerk, for instance. You know, what you'd want to do is you want to take that mousy clerk and make a 180-degree pivot. And instead of making him a mousy clerk with glasses and, geeky look, well, you make him a 6'5" bodybuilder with blonde hair who's also being the clerk. And now you've got something more interesting. People are going to go, oh, wow. It's going to catch their attention more because you've taken the familiar and you've just made it something totally different. So do that when you're thinking about how to keep your characters fresh, how to keep your scenes fresh. If most of the time your characters are meeting at a coffee house, well, maybe have them meet somewhere else. Maybe instead, hey, instead of having our coffee there, I got to take my dog to the vet. Can you just meet me across the street from the vet? And it turns out it's a dive bar. You have your characters in a dive bar instead of a coffee house for one. You do stuff like that, and that just it helps your creative juices, but it will also catch, I think, an agent's attention, a publisher's attention, because you're doing something a little more creative than the typical. Does that sort of answer what you were asking, Paul?
I think that's really great advice. I write historical, and so uh, it's not uncommon for my people to be in a house or on a horse or in a carriage or something of that nature. But yeah, very definitely, if I was writing contemporary, I think the whole idea of these nice people walking into this place and finding out it's a biker bar or something like that. I think that could be fun.
Well, it could be fun. It also catches the reader's attention, because people's attention spans are getting shorter and shorter every day, it seems, which is why there's so much emphasis on your first page, on the first few pages of your manuscript, is that if you're not catching them, you sort of go away. They just go away. And the more you can surprise them, the more you can show them things that they're not expecting, the more they'll stay in the story. Now, this is going back many, many years, and it's not romance, but one of the things they said about Dashiell Hammett, who was a detective writer back in the 1920s and 30s, is that he wrote scenes that people felt they'd never read before. That just the way he wrote them and the way he pictured the scenes, people had never seen it in their head. Now that's a real master at the craft, and a lot of people can't do that, obviously. But the more you can surprise the reader, the more you can move people around, try to do that. Now, having said that, there are some romance tropes. There are some things that romance readers expect, and you're going to have to hit those marks. And I'm not the person to tell you all the tropes, but I do know, like, the protagonist and the love interest have to get together at the end, otherwise it's not romance. And I also heard, and Paul, I don't know if you've heard this, but I've heard that neither one is supposed to cheat. That cheating is really frowned upon.
Well, I think it's more along the lines of, yeah, my very first novel. I'm sorry, my hero had a mistress as he was romancing the woman he married.
Oh,
But anyway, it's very important to make sure that if you take your main character, that the love interest character, whatever conflict you put there, whatever the wound of the primary character is, your love interest character cannot be guilty of doing the same thing. So, if she's been, if she's had a husband who is unfaithful, your love interest can't be the kind of guy who's been unfaithful to his wife or anything like that. If her interest, if her wound is that somebody has lied to her, maybe it hasn't been unfaithful but just lied to her, then the love interest can't be a liar.
I see.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
But I think, I've read obviously a lot of romance, and I'm always amazed, and I'm a little bit guilty of it myself, that the love interest here, he's been a womanizer his entire life, but he meets this woman and now he never wants to even look at another woman. But I remember when I got married, I was very offended as a young bride when my husband would be checking out these other girls. It made me feel very insecure.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me one time that, he was married but not dead. And that's when I realized, oh, you mean when it's summertime and those roofers are up there without their shirts on, I can look? Made a whole different uh, uh, point of view for him looking at somebody else too. Is like, look, just don't touch. So that's, I think, kind of what the idea is with romance.
Yeah.
They can look but not touch. And of course,
Yeah.
that the whole idea of them looking and not touching, of course, that means that you can definitely cause some conflict by the appearance of it looked as if it wasn't, but it looked as if, and that can create a lot of conflict. So.
And then the temptation itself is a conflict.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I have heard, and this is just common sense, don't abuse animals in your book. Just if we have seen over the last week or so, as the South Dakota governor has been raked over the coals, do not ever abuse an animal. It's so unsympathetic. And in fact, I've seen a number of agents that put on Query Tracker, and they'll say, we won't even look at a manuscript that has abuse of animals. Just don't ever do it.
Now the comment here from Connie: don't ever let the doggy die. Very definitely. You can off people, but not animals.
I was at a crime writers conference this has got to be at least 15 years ago. And unfortunately, I can't remember the writer. She was a British author. And she said it's the funniest thing in the crime area is if you can have a blackmailer and make them sympathetic. You can have a murderer, make them sympathetic. But if he abuses an animal, you're never going to get any sympathy. It's just that simple. It's just that simple, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have any other questions for Bruce? I don't even know how to look at Facebook Live to see if there's any questions there, Bruce.
Yeah, I'm looking at the chat here. I don't. Somebody's saying cheating is a part of life, unfortunately, and that is true. You know, cheating is part of life. I'm just talking about the tropes that are involved, and it's just it's hard. It's hard. You know, again, there's a lot of things that are part of life that people don't want to read. It's escapist literature. I would imagine romance in particular is more escapist than, say, a crime novel or some other areas. So, yeah.
Well, you know, this work in progress that I have right now, it's my antagonist who is the cheater.
Ah,
So if you want to get realistic like that, just don't make it your love interest or your prime or your protagonist, you know. You can have your antagonist do a lot of things. And the nice thing is sometimes, you know, since you want to have some character growth, your protagonist or your love interest, whichever, they come to a crisis in their life. And their crisis could be, am I going to go this way or am I going to go that way? Well, if you have an antagonist who went that way, then the reader will unconsciously recognize, oh, don't do that, or you're going to be just like the antagonist. They're going to be rooting for the guy to go this way instead of that way. So having an antagonist with some characteristics that the readers can see, if the love interest or the protagonist, whichever it is, makes the wrong choices, they're going to be just like the antagonist. They're going to be rooting for that person to that character to be making the right choices, and
yeah.
keeping them a little bit on the edge, not knowing right away, is good. So,
Well, I think what somebody's saying is, you know, characters are not black and white; they're gray, and I agree with that. You could do gray, but you can't do black. Is what I'm trying to say. You know, if a character is really bad, it's hard to make them sympathetic. Now, there are writers that can do it. There are writers that can take a really unsympathetic character, and by the end of the book, he or she is turned into redeemed at least enough. But boy, that is a tough sell. That is a tough sell. I'm working with this writer, and he's got a friendship in his book, and it's an abusive friendship, and he wants to explore how an abusive friendship can try to mend fences by the end of the book. But he's about 75% of the way in the book, and there hasn't been any redemption yet. And I'm just like, I'm tired of this character. This abusive character just does not interest me anymore. And now I've actually gotten to the point where I don't even like the other person in the friendship, because I'm saying, why are you still in the friendship? My God, this person's horrible to you. So it's a very tough thing to do, you know. And if you've got the skill, that's great. But a lot of you, I think, are probably aspiring, or maybe you've had one manuscript or two manuscripts. That's hard to do. I would try to stick to the tried and true, get down your craft first, and then try to make those harder stories.
I think that's good advice. So we can have the evil villain have a cute dog, and you can even have a evil cute cat. Very good.
Well, you know, speaking of evil, and this is something that I always recommend. And again, this is high level editing. It's not. Is that you shouldn't look at the protagonist and antagonist as one's good and one's bad, or one's evil and one's good. You want to just give them conflicting goals that are legitimate goals, and that will bring the conflict much harder for them because there's no bad guy. There's just two people who honestly think they're doing the right thing and are working on that. And they have to come to a realization that, yeah, maybe the other guy has a point, or the other woman has a point, even though they disagree. And that's a tough thing to write, but it makes your stories a lot deeper if you can give both sides a legitimate reason for what they're doing, at least in their head, a
That
legitimate
is,
reason.
yeah, that's such a good point. I see sometimes when I'm working with brand new authors that the villain is one of two things in the end. He's either just plain evil because he's evil, or he's mentally unbalanced, crazy. And I always feel like either of those choices is such a cop out because the antagonist should be the hero of his own story.
Right.
You know, just as you were saying, they have a justifiable reason for being how they are. The what I was just saying about this antagonist in the last novel that I published, yeah, he was a cheater, but you know, he was also a widower. So, and his motivation was that, you know, this is clear back in like 1812, where wealth was based on land. But with all the embargoes, on again, off again embargoes, you know, it devastated the Northeast states. And as a landowner, he still had to pay taxes.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, he was kind of up against it. Here he was perceived by everybody as being the richest man in the area, and you know, he had received all this land from, you know, way back in a land grant from the French king. And you know, here he is, he doesn't know what to do. And you know, he ends up becoming a smuggler during the War of 1812. And so, you know, but there's reasons why he did all
Right.
these bad things, and
Right.
that I think is what it all boils down to. give
Yeah.
give your bad guys justifiable reasons. So I'm glad that you brought that out.
I have, this is a real life story. It's not in a book. I knew a fellow, he had a small business, and he wasn't paying his tax. He wasn't paying the unemployment taxes for his employees because they had run into a rough patch. And when they finally caught up with him, which they did, because you know the authorities did catch up to him, he said straight out, he said, "Look, I had a choice. Either I stop paying the unemployment taxes or I fire everybody." And I just couldn't bring myself to fire people. So I cheated on the taxes, hoping I'd be able to recoup it. And they did cut a deal, and he ended up paying over a period of time. But you can sort of sympathize with a guy who says, I couldn't fire people. I just couldn't do it. So I cheated on my tax. Well, that's almost a hero to some people, you know?
Depends on whether or not you work for the IRS.
Right, right, right. Yeah. But yeah, so if you give them legitimate reasons for what they're doing, I think just makes it a much more compelling story.
And I don't think that has to be right up front. You know,
No,
he can be kind of a a bad person throughout most of the book, but before you end the book, you know, especially working up toward that climax and stuff, I think that the reader needs to see why this person has been the way they have been. And
that's right.
that goes for your protagonist and your love interest too. Obviously, they're not the person that they were meant to be at the beginning, and that's why they have the whole character arc. But the readers also need to see that change, that slow change. It's not like I'm this way here at the beginning and I'm this way all the way through, and then we get to the climax and ta-da, now I'm a new person. That's not how it works in real life. You know, we need to be able to see that change throughout the little bits at a time.
Yeah, and there could be step forwards and step backs too. You know,
Hmm.
it shouldn't be a continuous growth. You know, they could be growing and they slip back into a bad habit or whatever. You know, and they grow again, but they screw up or whatever. You know, that actually deepens things because then you start to worry he's not going to make it or she's not going to be redeemed. But obviously, in many of our stories, we like the hero to be redeemed.
Yeah. So, and these are all real good points. Some people might not think that some of these points have to do with editing, but I think they have a lot to do with editing, more of the developmental editing point of view rather than just the line editing. But you know, I'm so glad that you came and shared your knowledge with us, Bruce.
Well, I enjoyed it. I learned, actually, I learned a lot from you on this call about the romance genre. Although, again, I've never written in the romance genre. And for people out there, if you're looking for a romance editor, you got to go find somebody who knows uh, romance. But if anybody does have any questions, I'm online. My name's Bruce Rule. I'm on Facebook. You can reach out to me on Facebook, LinkedIn, wherever. I'm perfectly willing to talk to anybody about editing or writing anytime they need it.
Okay. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I guess we are going to wrap this up. Thank you very, very much. And I will get this up on YouTube. Where I'm at, it's 9 o'clock in the evening, so it'll probably be tomorrow before it's up on YouTube. But I will post in Facebook that it is ready to watch, because I know we do have a lot of people who go and watch the replay.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate everybody's comments. You have an audience that knows a lot about romance. That's great.
Okay, thank you, Bruce.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.